has been put to bed by both Russian leaders and by separatist groupings in the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Why is it being put to bed? Well, the concept was flawed from the very beginning, and it was based on an unrealistic understanding of Ukraine that continues to dominate the Russian leadership. The fundamental problems in Ukraine between the Ukrainian state and the Russian state are not just a question of the Crimea or regional problems in the east. They're far more fundamental. Just today, President Putin at a congress in St. Petersburg described Ukrainians and Russians again as one people, and therefore Ukrainians and Russians should always remain together in the same kind of sphere of influence. In other words, he's gone back to pre-Soviet Tsarist views of Ukrainians as little Russians. Even so-called pro-Russian presidents of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma, Viktor Yanukovych, never mind the so-called nationalist presidents, Kravchuk, Yushchenko, and Poroshenko. Even Kuchma and Yanukovych had deep fundamental problems with Russia. It took 3 years for Boris Yeltsin to come to Ukraine to meet President Kuchma to sign the interstate treaty in the 1990s. Today, we remember that in 2010, Yanukovych gave Russia everything that it wanted on the domestic questions of like the Holodomor issue and on the foreign questions such as the Black Sea Fleet and NATO. Nevertheless, Russia repaid with the highest gas price in Europe for Ukraine. So Russia simply has far more deeper fundamental problems with the very concept of Ukraine and wants to have Ukraine not as an independent state, but basically as a kind of an autonomous republic of the Russian sphere of influence. To have somebody in power in Kiev would be the equivalent of Kadyrov running Chechnya on his behalf. And that's what he hoped Yanukovych was going to become in late 2013 when he threw money at Yanukovych as a bribe. And this is one of the major fundamental problems that Putin has. As a cynic, he thinks that there's a price that on everybody is willing to accept. And therefore he found it extremely difficult and still finds it impossible to understand how people can go on the streets and protest for values, for rights, for demands, for justice and dignity. And therefore he has to explain this by claiming that they are paid by the CIA, that this is a Western-funded conspiracy. The idea that they would go on the streets without being paid is something beyond his comprehension. The question here is again fundamental over what Russia fails to appreciate about Ukraine as a country and as a people. If you approach the Ukrainian question with the view that Ukrainians don't exist as a nation, that there is no Ukrainian state, or as he put it to President George Bush in 2008, he said, George, you realize there's no such thing as Ukraine. And he added that the east and south of Ukraine were given to Ukraine by the Soviet Union and they should be really part of Russia. This is 7 years ago. If you approach Ukraine in such a manner, then you're not really going to have a deep understanding of the dynamics of how the country ticks. And hence, this explains the complete failure of the so-called New Russia project. It failed because the 8 oblasts, 8 regions of east and south Ukraine, which are Russian-speaking, are first of all not one entity. They're very different. Ukraine is regionally very pluralistic in that sense. Yes, there was some degree of support for that pro-Russian Putin orientation in both the Crimea and in Donbass, the 2 regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. But the reasons for that was because Soviet identity was quite strong in the Crimea and the Donbass. Those were the only 2 regions of Ukraine where a larger number of people said that they expressed a Soviet cultural identity over Russian or Ukrainian. That's not true anywhere else. So the pro-Putin camp tended to be people with a Soviet orientation. And they in the past had voted for the Communist Party, for Russian nationalist groups in the Crimea, and also for the Party of Regions. But that kind of identity is not to be found in other parts of so-called New Russia. Particularly in 4 regions, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson and Mykolaiv, so half of so-called New Russia, there simply isn't any pro-separatist sentiment. No pro-Putin sentiment. In 2 other regions, Odessa and Kharkiv, there were what I would call, these are 2 swing regions, and there was street fighting in March to early May of 2014. But pro-Ukrainian forces really grabbed the initiative from late March, April onwards. And even in Odessa, which we tend to think of as a very Russian-speaking city, strong ties to the Tsarist Empire and the former USSR, even there, pro-Ukrainians, particularly young people, dominated the streets of Odessa during the troubles of late April and early May, which led to the deaths of a large number of people in the trade union building during the fire. So even in those two places, pro-Ukrainian groupings, again, particularly young people, came out on top. I visited Odessa for a third time in early June of this month and met, for example, local members of the Odessa Samooborona, self-defense forces, all Russian speakers. When you ask them the question, is language an issue for you? Is this a kind of a question, because it keeps being brought up all the time, and they looked at me as though I'd asked them a really stupid question. It's not an issue. Simply not an issue. And it's not an issue for all the volunteers groups that exist throughout this region, dominated primarily by women and dominated primarily by Russian speakers, by the way. So again, another misconception that Putin had was that Russian speaker equals Ruski, equals Eastern Slav, equals pro-Putin. It's not the case. You can be a Russian speaker of Ukraine and you can be a Ukrainian patriot. You can be a Russian speaker with even some kind of cultural sympathy for Pushkin, for Dostoevsky. You have maybe family ties to Russia. Doesn't mean to say you're pro-Putin. Doesn't mean to say you're anti-Ukrainian. And that was, again, a major misnomer, a major miscalculation on the part of Vladimir Putin. Because for him to move troops in, for Russia to adopt hybrid war tactics, that requires some support, even minimal support on the ground. You can't do hybrid war where you're hiding and camouflaging your own forces amongst local separatists, unless there are locals there willing to back you up. And they found that there were very few people willing to back them up in 6 of the 8 regions of New Russia. And hence, it was a failure. Even in the very Soviet and very party regions, and prior to party regions, communist-dominated Donbass, the separatists were on the verge of being defeated by the ramshackle Ukrainian army and volunteer formations in the summer of last year, and it required a Russian invasion to turn the tide in August in the Ilovaisk. So even there, and today, after all the investment that Putin's put in, after the deaths of civilians and military and separatist casualties, probably reaching up to closer to 20,000 in total, even there, separatists still only control a third of the Donbass, even after all that effort. So Novorossiya has been a failure. But in another aspect, Putin is successful. And where he's successful, and this is where I think Ukraine has an area which is problematic, which it's not clear to me that the West completely, particularly the Europeans, completely understand. They often describe this as a frozen conflict. It's not a frozen conflict. Frozen conflicts took place emerged in Moldova, in the Transnistria region, in Georgia, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and in Azerbaijan, and in Nagorno-Karabakh. There, the central governments in all 3 countries were defeated by separatists allied to Russian forces. And since the defeat, there's been peace on the ground, because one side won. The Azerbaijanis, Georgians, and Moldovans lost the wars. In 2008, President Saakashvili tried to turn the tide by taking back South Ossetia, and it backfired. So that was an exception. In the case of Donbass, we have a very different situation. Neither side has won the war. So it's not a frozen conflict, it's an unresolved conflict. And probably Vladimir Putin would prefer it to stay this way, because he's going to keep on applying pressure, keep the Ukrainians guessing by massing troops on the border, which means Ukrainians are going to have to assume that potentially there's an invasion threat, because it ties up forces. That means a large amount of the Ukrainian budget will be devoted to security affairs and to the military. A large amount of resources that the Ukrainian state can't afford at the moment, and it would be better if it was invested in, say, socio-economic and other areas. And the Russian-backed separatists are going to continue to pinprick, to launch attacks, launch sort of small-scale incursions at different points along the front line to keep the Ukrainians guessing. And this has the advantage from the Russian point of view that 5, 10, 3 sometimes as low as that, but a number of Ukrainian soldiers die each day. I mean, is that potentially sustainable? So that makes it very different to these 3 other frozen conflicts, where the killings and the deaths of soldiers on both sides ended. That's not happened in Ukraine. Putin will continue to prefer to leave this not as a frozen conflict, but as an unresolved conflict. And the separatist leadership talks about retaking back the Donbass, talks about taking even Kharkiv. The Ukrainian leaders have to take that seriously, that threat. They have to devote resources to it. But at the same time, it's a kind of a phony war on the part of even the Ukrainian side. Because only about 60,000 forces are in the so-called ATO, the anti-terrorist operation, which is pretty miserable and small amount of forces. UPA, after all, fighting in the underground with no external support in the 1940s, fighting for a decade from 1942 to the early 50s, had 40,000 forces, armed units. Far more, up to 100,000, were mobilized in Western Ukraine in 1918 to fight with the Poles for control over Galicia. We're not even talking about World War II. So one has to ask why President Poroshenko has continued to adopt the mythology that this is an anti-terrorist operation. If you look at the legislation for anti-terrorist operations, this is actually illegal. Because an anti-terrorist operation is a one-off thing, to take back a building or to take back a town, and it's a very limited short-term operation. It's not something which is long-term. The response from the Ukrainian government side is that we can't move to a full-scale mobilization and a state of emergency because that would mean the dismantling of Ukraine's democratic institutions. That's hogwash. Canada, the United States, and Britain fought World War II with their democratic institutions intact. The Canadian Parliament, US Congress, wasn't dissolved in World War II. It continued to function. So this is really a question of very bad Soviet-style legislation still in place in Ukraine that would require some kind of World War II type of state of emergency. But there are many examples in the Western world where democratic procedures continue to take place during wartime. There may be some minor restrictions, but on the whole, democratic institutions continue to function. So the final factor on this is that and it's something that, again, Western governments don't really want to deal with, is we have to assume that Vladimir Putin is going to stay in power as long as he's alive. He's not going to leave office. You can't leave office in Russia. If you leave office, you're dead. You go to prison. You lose your money you've stolen. And there's no guarantees. You know, there's no honor amongst thieves. And therefore, if that's the case, then the annexation of the Crimea is going to remain indefinite as long as Vladimir Putin is president of Russia, which is until he dies or is incapacitated. And secondly, the conflict in the East is going to continue. Vladimir Putin has no interest in resolving this conflict. He has no interest because he needs a conflict to simmer along, because he hasn't achieved his goals in Ukraine, which is to install a kind of a puppet in Kiev, however kind of fanciful and ludicrous this concept is. Where would such a figure appear from? Yanukovych was tried and it failed. But more importantly, he needs the conflict to simmer along to keep himself popular in Russia, to keep the Russian population distracted from socioeconomic issues and from corruption. And that's in particular the case as you approach the next and upcoming Russian Duma and presidential elections. So all these factors mean that Ukraine is in a very difficult position. You have, with Vladimir Putin likely to continue this unresolved conflict, with maybe the option of invasion, or I think that's unlikely because of the difficulties of it being implemented. But certainly an unresolved so-called hybrid conflict or small insurgency, tying up Ukrainian budgetary forces and security forces, keeping the Ukrainians guessing, with President Poroshenko not really wanting to accept the fact that Ukraine's at war with Russia, yet the public opinion in Ukraine is of the opinion that Ukrainians are at war with Russia. 80% or so of Ukrainians believe that. And we have the West as well, which wants to pretend Minsk II has been implemented. So there's a kind of a phony side to this war both in the Russian side. Russians are not on the ground. The Russians keep telling us they're nothing to do with us. On the Ukrainian side and on the Western side. Because of all of this, there isn't really a concrete Ukrainian policy as to what to do or how to resolve this question. And that lack of strategy towards the East is also a factor which means that the conflict is going to probably drift along for many years to come. Sadly, because the people who will be suffering from this will be the civilians on the ground. Thank you.